one person can stand up and speak up and be the light in that kind of situation, there are others who are maybe on the pathway but don't have that courage, that go, oh, hang on a minute, I resonate with what they're doing, and I'm actually going to speak up, or I'm going to support them, whether that's publicly or silently. It's still moving us towards progress. So it often comes down to one person, and one person of influence can make a huge difference.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented.
Gosh, where do I even begin with Elizabeth Lang? This conversation, for me, has been so deep. Elizabeth is not surface level. She is deep as it gets. This conversation that I've just finished recording with her, we've gone way, way over the allocated time. She is somebody, when you ask her a question, she just doesn't answer surfacely or just lightly. She goes deep. She gives examples and more and just expounds on it. And I felt like I was a student again. She's shared things that I myself teach and talk about and hold space for, but she's just gone deeper and just allowed the understanding and the knowledge to sink in deeper. For me, I always say that I am a student for life. This is work that I'm continually learning. I'm educating myself. And there's one particular analogy that she uses about how racism is so subconscious. You know, a lot of people tend to say and think, I'm a good person, I'm nice, I have lots of people from racially diverse backgrounds, friends. And so this is great work that is being done, but it needs to get to those people who are very exclusive, those people who are not inclusive. And so this message and this work needs to get to them. And yes, it does, but this message is for all of us. And the example she uses in our conversation about a little girl, two little girls, a white girl and a black girl, and just an experiment that was done. And you've got to listen to that bit in the podcast. I'm not going to give it away. You just have to listen. I loved this conversation. This is one that I highly recommend. Listen, come back again and listen, and then come back again and listen again, because you'll be getting different things, and things will just go deeper and deeper as you listen, and your level of awareness and understanding will grow immensely. But before I take you to our conversation, let me tell you a little bit about Elizabeth. Elizabeth Lang is the founding CEO of Diversity Focus, a research and training consultancy that focuses on workplace culture, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Elizabeth has a background in community development, tertiary teaching in social sciences, and qualitative research. She is a seasoned speaker and has presented on national and international platforms, including the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. In line with her passion for gender equity and inclusion, she is currently completing, no less, her doctorate studies at Curtin University. In recognition of her work, Elizabeth was named in the 2021 Global 100 Under 40 Most Influential People of African Descent. Without further ado, here is Elizabeth Lang. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Represented Podcast. And if you're not a stranger on these streets of Represented, then you very much know my next guest, Elizabeth Lang. If you've been in my program Represented, you know how you love her. And she is here, and I cannot wait to have this conversation with you, Elizabeth. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be back again.
I'm happy to have you. Elizabeth, for the sake of those who may not know you, could you please share a little bit about how you arrived here doing this work of racial and gender equity?
Yeah, absolutely. So my story does not begin in Australia. My family and I moved here when I was a child. I was 10 years old when I moved. I was born in what is present-day Sudan, which is a different country to South Sudan, which is where my folks originally come from. And I spent the first 6 years of my life in Sudan. And then at the age of 6, we moved to Egypt. And a wise decision on my father's part to relocate the family to Egypt because of the civil war between the North and the South. And so I spent 4 years in Egypt. And then I think just by chance encounter, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees had an office in Cairo, where I was staying at the time, and they were processing applicants who wanted to relocate on humanitarian grounds. And so through that, my father applied and we ended up here. Now, a foundational part of, I guess, my story that links actually to why I do the work that I do and the influence that my father's had on my life is growing up, because of the Civil War, he'd always been involved in the freedom movement. And because of that, when you are anti-government, there's always a target on your back. And I think for him, he was always very conscious that it was not safe. Even though in Khartoum, where I was born and where I stayed for the first 6 years, there was no concept of danger or, I mean, the war, the destruction was happening largely in the South. So we were completely sheltered from that. In fact, when we moved to Egypt, it was kind of like, because they didn't sit us down and explain that there's a civil war. We just thought it was a family holiday. And it's not really until I got older and that I started to hear of a civil war. And because when I think back to my childhood, I had a very normal childhood. I went to school at the age of 5 or 6. I lived in a peaceful neighborhood, etc. But I think that's also the nature of war, is that there's many different narratives. And I think often people think of war or, refugee status in very particular kind of narratives of, refugee displacement, etc. I was very lucky to have been, that's not anything that I've ever witnessed or experienced. But because of his political activities, we were at risk. And so he relocated the family to Egypt and then again to Australia. So that's how I guess that's how we ended up here. And then I've lived here pretty much, majority of my life now. And a part of why I say that that's linked to why I do what I do, because having grown up around my father, he had a very strong influence on who I am as a person, on my outlook. And I remember I would have been about 14 or 15. He used to write these letters to the government about various human rights abuses. He was very old school. So initially he used to handwrite and he wrote in cursive writing. And then one day out of the blue, he just decided, well, hang on, I've got a teenage daughter who can type. Why am I, handwriting these letters? So what he started doing, he would handwrite them. Then he would hand me a bunch and say, here, type these out. And you can imagine my 14-year-old, 15-year-old self, who had better things to do with my time, was not happy about this. It was enforced upon me.
Yeah.
I look back at the experience now as such a gift, because being exposed at that age to content around human rights, around injustice, around the important, and also, I guess, being a part of the activity of actually advocating and speaking out against injustice had a firm impact on who I am. And it didn't kind of click until many years later that I thought, wow, when I actually think back to everything I've done, the decisions that I've made concerning my studies, the kind of work that I've gone into, it's always had a human rights basis to it. And that's really where it comes from. So that's how I ended up here. And that's how I guess, a part of just a small snippet into my upbringing and how that's influenced me as far as my father's activities. And then I guess also because he's no longer here, he passed close to 8.5 years ago now. Because he's no longer here, they hold. I see it as such a gift, and I see it as a gift. Yeah, it's really shaped who I've become, and I'm really grateful for that. So that's a little part of my story. I'm not sure if I don't think I shared that last time, but thought I might get a different angle this time.
Thank you. I feel like I've heard it, but I've heard it differently this time. Sometimes you hear something and you hear it differently. And yet, you've told it differently from last time. And I can't help but think that you're a mom now, with your own kids. And are they at the age where they know what mommy does? And is it something that you talk about openly? And are they showing any interest?
Mm. They definitely know what I do. We definitely talk about it openly, but as far as interest, I'm not sure. I think my son is very entrepreneurial, so I can see that in him. It's not necessarily about nothing to do with diversity. He's got other interests, but he's very my daughter, on the other hand, is she's an interesting mix. She's a creative, but also very academic. So she's really good with writing, and so I think they will take whatever paths. But I would be lying if I said that who I am and my journey has not had an influence on them, because they see my work. But also, I think, sadly though, these are things that we've had to talk about because they have experienced racism at school, and they continue to experience racism. In fact, my son had his first experience when he was only 7, um, and he had an experience where I'm sorry, he was 6. A 7-year-old white boy said to him, "Get your black African hand off my book." And had the teacher not called me, sorry, the school principal, had she not called and quoted those words on the phone and said, "Elizabeth, this is what's happened today. I don't want your son to feel like he has to utter those words to you, but this is what another child said to your son, and this is how we're addressing it," etc. So that's the first kind of I guess, raw experience at least I'm aware of. And they've continued to experience. So my son is now, he's nearly 12 next month, and my daughter will be 9 next month. But sadly, they know about racial injustice because they're not immune from it. And so conversations in our household are quite, I guess I would be irresponsible as a parent if I don't have these conversations with them, because they do. My son gets called the N-word at school every now and then. People, there are things that happen daily. And if we're not having these conversations, if I'm not kind of speaking life into them, if I'm not encouraging them or talking through scenarios on how do you respond to different things, then I'm setting them up for failure. That's the reality of being a dark-skinned Black person living in Australia. And so these are conversations that we have had and continue to have in our household. But I think for me, obviously there's the racial trauma associated with these experiences. But I also know that for me as a Black woman, I have a responsibility and an obligation to ensure that I'm raising them in a way where they have the courage and the strength to speak up for themselves. And I always tell them, I'm always here for you. And they know, like, I'm the first one in the office, And even my son one day said, I think he overheard one of the kids in the neighborhood, another African kid, explain something that happened and how he wasn't sure how to tell his parents. And then he goes, I'm telling you, if that was my mom, she'd be in the office first thing in the morning. So they know that I'm a fighter, and they know that I will always speak up. But I always tell them, look, I'm a huge advocate for you, but you have to be your first and biggest advocate. So I think that's really important. And I think that that's something that for any Black or brown parent raising children in Australia needs to be mindful of, that responsible parenting as a Black person is actually preparing them for the reality of the world. And it's not about traumatizing the child, because they will experience these things. It's about preparing them. So yes, sadly, ongoing conversations, but I think there's also moments of joy and things to celebrate as well as part of all that.
I have to hand it to that principal who did give you a call and tell you what happened, because a lot of times in schools, in institutions, these are things that are covered up, or it's like, oh, he didn't mean it, or he didn't know what he was saying. We dealt with it, and that's that. You may never hear it, or you hear it from your son much later on. Really, really have to acknowledge that principal for what they did and giving you the call. And so, Elizabeth, how do you deal with this? Do you have conversations with the school? Are they educating their staff? Is there a way in which they deal with these things? Are there policies in place? Students being educated, the harmful use of the N-word and all the things that come with, the racial slurs. Are they being educated?
I think as far as, so I'll talk in several layers. As far as the school that my children go to, and for context, that experience that my son had when he was 6 is a different school to where he is now.
Right.
Now, the school where he is now, there's been many, many issues in the past which have not been addressed to my satisfaction. So the usual scenario is, someone said something, but it was kind of minimized, or it sometimes even attempts to completely deny it. And I say, look, my kids do not make up stories about racism. Yeah. In fact, they don't like talking about it. It's a very uncomfortable topic. So for you to stand here and try to gaslight me that somehow it's in their imagination, or they're reading into it, or they misheard, you don't mishear, you don't, it's just not possible. So I think in terms of my kids' school where they are now, they're starting to get better, and particularly because things got really, really bad with my daughter this year. And so they've started to listen more and more. As far as educating teachers, I've sent them resources in the past. I've sent them free resources. More recently, we had a meeting when things really got bad. I said, look, you guys need to do something about this. There are many scenarios where my kids will say the teacher heard it, but then they pretended like they didn't hear anything, and then other kids think it's okay. And I'm always telling the school, choosing not to respond is also a response, and it's a very harmful response, because it says to the child who's been racially abused that they have no safety and that there's no one to trust in the school. And it also communicates the message to the child who maybe makes a racist comment that I can get away with it, and that comment is actually okay. And everybody else who's observing sees these dynamics and they go, oh, so this is the standard around here. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of always in the office. I've lost count how many times I've gotten in there. But more recently, and I think this speaks to the nature of this work sometimes, is more recently things have changed. And it was actually my son who noticed, who said, oh, Mom, it's not until Miss Spencer came along that things are starting to change at school. Now people are getting, expelled or suspended or whatever. People are being made to sit, in the principal's office for lunch, depending on, the severity of maybe the comment. Yeah. And it was my son who picked it up and said, oh, it's only until Miss Spencer came along. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting observation, because it's true. Yes. They are more active and listening more and seem to be doing more. But that's only very recent. But that's because there's one person who said, I'm not going to tolerate racial violence at school, and I'm going to address things as they arise. And sadly, when you look at, workplaces and other scenarios where these things happen, it's very similar. People will hear a comment, so maybe there's a nervous laugh, maybe there's people are uncomfortable, no one says anything because someone is going to address it. There's just total silence. And that silence is a very powerful and a very harmful response. And that's what I've continued to tell the school. You can sweep it under the rug and pretend like it's not a problem, but there will come a time when you're going to have to respond. And I think what's prepared me to some degree with the dealing with schools was long before I had my children, with my niece, who, I just hear her talk about these things. This happened at school and the teacher said, and someone did. And I'd go, hang on a minute, what? And I started telling her, look, next time there's a meeting, they call your mom, call me and I'll come along. Now my daughter, sorry, my sister, she's the most gentle, like she will not challenge anyone. She'll go in there and apologize, and I'll go and I'll sit next to her. And after she's done massaging the situation, I'll go, hang on a minute. So you've explained that this, and that happened. Were you a witness? No. But you believe the white child and you've assumed that my niece is lying, and you, as a result, have suspended her for 3 days. Or, comments about, a group of 5 African girls were sitting together and one teacher said, oh, you look like a gang. Why don't you sit with other kids? And I say, do you go around to groups of 5 white children and say, you look like a gang? That's a racist comment. In fact, one of the last meetings I had, this was many years ago, about 15 years ago, I said to the principal and the people that were in the meeting, I said, look, this is about the 3rd time we've come in here, and there's a bit of a theme with these conversations. I just want you to know that we're getting tired of this, and the next time we get a complaint, I'm choosing not to deal with you any longer, and we're going to go straight to the Department of Education. And as a result, they kind of backed off my niece, but sadly, they've continued with the other kids. And I think that that's often what happens with racial violence, is that particularly in an institution, whether it's a school or a workplace, when those in leadership are either uncomfortable or for whatever reason choosing to be silent and not respond, it sets us a very harmful standard for the culture of whether it's a school or the workplace. And sometimes you just need one person who goes, you know what, this is not okay, and we're actually going to do something about it. Mm-hmm. And when that one person can stand up and speak up and be the light in that kind of situation, there are others who are maybe on the pathway but don't have that courage, that go, oh, hang on a minute, I resonate with what they're doing, and I'm actually going to speak up, or I'm going to support them, whether that's publicly or silently. Mm-hmm. It's still moving us towards progress. So it often comes down to one person, and one person of influence can make a huge difference.
It can, and it takes me back to a lot of the conversations that I have with my students inside my program Represented, and they say, Annie, I'm only one person. What difference can I possibly make? Let this be a very real example to you that one person can make a difference. Miss Spencer, and for your son to pick up on that and go like, it has been different since she's come along. This is not being tolerated anymore. It only does take one person. And I've followed you throughout this year on LinkedIn, Elizabeth, and one of the things that has come through is silence being a weapon in the face of racism, especially as it pertains to the war that we've witnessed in the Middle East and many other things that have come up. Silence is a weapon that is used, and a lot of times silence is what has allowed things to get to where they are. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I silence is a huge weapon. And I think, you might have seen that I shared a post recently about the damage, the destruction that silence has and creates, because it sends a message. And I think sometimes people go, well, I don't know what to say, so I'll just not say anything. And it's like, no, you cannot. However you choose to respond is a response. You need to just accept that to begin with. And silence can actually be weaponized. And I think we've seen that, around the world with what's been going on in the Middle East, with even people's resistance to calling what's going on in Gaza a genocide.
Yes.
When you look at the Genocide Convention, that's what it is. When you look at the International Court of Justice, it's been named a genocide. Like, there are genocide experts who evaluate these, international crises, but for people to still turn around and say no, or for people to somehow minimize what that means by trying to justify and finding scenarios to say, but this, but that. But it's like, hang on a minute. The moment we say but, we've completely dismissed, whatever it is that came before that statement. Because if we say, yes, there's death and destruction, yes, there's violence, or there's ethnic cleansing or any kind of mass violence, and then we say but, like what more can you say after that? And it's been incredibly sad, and I think the media's obviously had a huge influence in shaping public perception, but I also think that the masses for generations have been conditioned to see human beings in a particular light to such degree that people have almost been conditioned or desensitized to the suffering of some human beings.
Absolutely.
So we find ways to justify mass, acts of violence when they're perpetrated against some groups, but we would be up in arms if the same acts of violence were perpetrated against another group, regardless of the reasoning. Like, we wouldn't even look for reasons.
Yeah.
We would start with, well, hang on a minute, you cannot destroy human life and you cannot kill innocent people. And that's where the conversation ends. There's no buts with certain individuals or certain communities, but there is a but when it comes to some forms of human suffering. And I think that it's a part of the reason why we all have work to do, because I think people often think of racism in very kind of extreme, over, obviously, white supremacist violence and, killing and murdering, that is racism. But people also don't understand that racism is a continuum. And it starts up here in terms of how we see each other, how we see ourselves, and how we see others. And so our empathy shifts and changes towards different communities because we've been conditioned to see particular, racial groups. For example, if you were to see something in the media about a white person who's experiencing pain, people are more likely, and there's been experiments done, like you can see it on like visually. I think there was something online where they showed a little black girl and a little white girl, and the response was so different. So the child looked like they were alone in a kind of busy mall area with a little black girl, the same age, probably about 5 or 6. Everyone walked past her. No one even noticed that a child was alone. The little white girl, it took seconds for someone to come up to her, kneel, and you can see that they were asking, was your parents, you're okay or whatever. And so you kind of go, hang on a minute. All of those people who walk past the black child, they were not consciously thinking, I see a little black girl and I don't care about her well-being and I'm just going to pass her. They were not consciously thinking about being racist. It was a subconscious conditioning that led them to not even see the child as potentially being in harm's way or potentially needing help. And I think people need to understand that it's much deeper than someone making a racist comment, than someone choosing to cross the street because they see, a black person or Aboriginal person. And I say that because when you talk about racism against Aboriginal people in Australia, it is the absolute worst. And I can confidently say that even as a very dark-skinned black woman, the racism that Aboriginal people experience is far worse than what people that look like me experience. So I think there's that dynamic, but people need to understand that it's a deep conditioning. And until you start to do the inner work, people focus on, the cosmetics. That's not where the change is. It has to start here on the inside in terms of how we think, how we see ourselves and how we see others. And everybody's got work to do, including Black and brown people, because there's also the reality of internalized racism and internalized inferiority and how that shows up in the way that we behave, in the things that we do, in the decisions that we make. We all have work to do. But I think, it doesn't serve us when we think of racism as these extreme acts of violence. You don't have to join the Klan to be a racist. You can have very racist ideas and be married to a Black person, have a Black child, work with Black people, have a Black friend. People say, oh, I can't be racist, I've got a Black friend. No, that doesn't give you immunity from racism.
Elizabeth, oh my goodness. Like that example you've given about unconsciously being racist, that example of the little child is absolute gold. Absolute gold. And if you're listening to this and you're going like, I hadn't looked at it from that perspective, please know that there is work to be done. Because a lot of times the conversations I'm having, people are like, you're doing great work, Annie. Keep it up, keep going. And they think that this is the work that is required for those who are racist, those who are extremists, those ones we've probably lost them and they're not going to come and sign up for a class with you or myself. It is us, those people who are in everyday conversations, those people who are thinking, oh, but I'm kind, I donate, I have, World Vision children that I'm supporting, and so on and so forth. You kind of exempt yourself. You kind of feel like I'm immune to this, to your point, as you said earlier. But there's so much that we don't see and we don't know. And even as Black and Brown people, as you've said, there's a lot of work for us to do, that internal inferiority, how we are showing up, how we are speaking, how we are occupying or not occupying space, how we choose to wear our hair or not wear our hair, what will be seen, professionally or not. Like, there's no way I could have shown up in my corporate job looking like this. The comments I would have gotten would have been impossible to go through my entire day because somebody would have had something to say about my hair. And so the point here is there's a lot of work to be done. Now, Elizabeth, we're almost at the end of 2024. What have you witnessed in your work as far as racial and gender equity goes, be it locally here in Australia or even internationally? What have you witnessed this year?
Yeah, I've witnessed a lot. I'll just say, just to kind of close off, I love the way you summarized it. A takeaway for people: remember that nice people can be racist too. So I think that's important for people to keep that in mind. Now, as far as what I've witnessed a lot, and I've witnessed a shift. Obviously, what's happening overseas, particularly in the United States. I keep an eye on a lot on kind of the global aspects of my work.
Yeah.
Because it does shape, Australia is always only 2 steps behind the US and the UK.
There you go.
And I knew long before, like when I started to kind of see signs of the backlash in the US, it got really bad really quickly, I think more than I had anticipated. And I've seen how that is starting to influence people in Australia. Now, my experience has always been, when we talk about equity, when we talk about diversity, etc., race has always been the poor cousin. Everybody wants to talk about everything and anything when it comes to diversity, but no one wants to talk about race. So that's always been my experience from day one when I started doing this work. But it's gotten worse gradually because obviously there's more ammunition now with what's going on in the US and the massive backlash to DI, to the degree where there's like legal battles.
Yes.
Universities have been taken to court for affirmative action, etc. It's really bad. And Australia being always one that follows the US, the trend has sadly come here. But I think Australia is more in danger when I compare it to the US, because even though the US, the US has got extremes on both ends, extremes in terms of what we see with racial violence, but also extremes in terms of, like, positively, in terms of the dialogue and the conversation is so much more progressed, and there seems to be more of a willingness, at least on scale, to address racial inequity in the US. Right. Now, Australia is much more vulnerable because Australia does not have that foundation. And so when we're starting to kind of sow the seeds of equity and justice and racial justice in Australia, and then to have them completely kind of just uprooted, but before they've had time to kind of germinate and grow, it's really scary. And I think people are not understanding the gravity of what's going on in the US and the impact in Australia. Because Australia has never been a country that has been open to talking about race. I mean, even just saying the word race or racism, you can almost hear a pin drop in the room. An anti-racism workshop, and then you say the word racism, and then people get uncomfortable. It's like, well, we're going to talk about the thing, and we can't address a thing that we're not willing to give a name. So let's start there. But that's where Australia's at. There's such a resistance already to talk about racism. And for the influence of the backlash to then come into an environment where the conversation hasn't actually really started, I would say. I think that's, I'm not minimizing that there has been progress, but in all honesty, I think DEI is branded as this generic thing about equity. And we want to talk about equality in very general terms. And we're okay talking about with specific forms of inequality. But the moment we bring up race, people get uncomfortable and the conversation either gets watered down or dismissed or shut down. And interestingly, what I've also noticed is when you talk about inequality in general terms, if you zero in on a specific form, say you're talking about inequality in terms of people with disability, or say you're talking about LGBTQIA+, or say, whatever form you're talking about, people understand that is the inequality that we're addressing. Now, interestingly, when we talk about race, people say, but what about people with disability? But what about LGBT rights? But it's like, hang on a minute. We're not saying that those forms of inequality and oppression are not important. They don't exist. But why are you attempting to divert the conversation by trying to say, but what about so-and-so?
Yes.
And when we talk about those other forms, I've never heard anyone say, but what about race? Never.
Wow. And why do you think that's the case when it comes to race? Why do you think there's the but what about?
I think it's an attempt to not have the conversation, and it's an attempt to completely shut down the reality of racial injustice. And then people say silly things like, I don't see color. And yes, I understand the intent behind that comment is, you don't judge people on the basis of their skin or whatever, but we all see color. And in fact, if we didn't, you wouldn't even be making that statement to begin with.
That's it.
It makes no sense. But it's a complete attempt to completely, again, silence the conversation and to not have dialogue about this. And I think it's also an attempt for people, because no one wants to unpack their inherent racial bias or the racism that they've internalized. And people, no one wants to go there. It's an uncomfortable situation. And so we would rather distract ourselves when we're in, having these conversations, says, but what about so-and-so? What about this form of oppression or inequality? Is that not equally as the same? But it's like, hang on a minute, this is not a hierarchy. We're not minimizing any other form of oppression. But if we're talking about racism, then we have to talk about racism. But there's such an attempt to completely silence again, silence as a weapon.
Yes, absolutely.
Used massively.
Ooh. Elizabeth, you have just brought masterclass after masterclass. Like each question can just be an entire talk, an entire workshop that we can just sit here and unpack. I want to change the conversation a little bit. I know you've been working on a new innovation around something that you're calling main caps. It's an Australian-based venture, ensuring accessibility to water sports for individuals with, hello, big hair, voluminous hair. How did that come about? Because, oh my goodness, I remember when I was in high school and in primary school, and swimming was just one of those sports that we did it. But the girls, our hair, like you had to have it braided, and when you had it braided, it couldn't fit in those Speedo swim caps. You know how tight and thin
they're so
the
small.
Speedo, and they'd rip, and my mom would get so upset. She's like, "We only bought this the other day." What? And then they had others that were thicker, but boy, they looked nasty. You're like, I have to wear this to school. I won't have any friends. So tell me about main caps.
Yeah, so main caps is still in development. I would say that we haven't quite launched yet, but I'll talk about it and how it is I came about to kind of think of the idea. Now, again, similar to yourself, I dreaded swimming in primary school, and for me, I remember actually a time, it would have been maybe as because when I came to Australia, I started in year 4. It was early on, but I remember hating swimming, absolutely hating swimming. And at the time, my young self didn't think it was because of the swim cap, but when I look back, it actually was. And it's not until my daughter came along, and so one day we were, organizing for swimming, and then we're like, hang on a minute, there's no cap that actually fits her, and she always had braids. And I remember the anxiety. Like I remember a moment where it's like I zoomed out into my, 11-year-old self
Yeah.
hating swimming as I was having this conversation with my daughter. It was like a flashback. Then I was like, hang on a minute. There's no Australian-based swim caps for people with big hair. Like it just
Yes.
came from. And so I started searching, and then I actually learned that there was a company who provides swim caps based in the UK, and then there's others, like there's one in South Africa that's also quite big, etc. But I was like, yes, there's ones out there, but it'll take a couple of weeks for me to receive this cap. There's nothing in Australia that is for me, for my daughter. And so that's really where the idea came from. I was like, hang on a minute, we need swim caps for big hair. And we need it to be local and Australian based so that no one has to wait 3 weeks when the swimming
Yes.
program is next week.
Oh,
That's really where it came from.
no.
And also, I guess, in terms of accessibility, I mean, I want our kids to be able to enjoy swimming, but also it's a life skill. And so when we resist swimming,
Yeah.
because we have a barrier to do with our hair, because
Mhm.
in the market there isn't anything that kind of meets that need, then it actually leads to other issues as well. Well, when you think about water safety, when you think
Exactly.
about, people developing, skills around swimming, and the safety of having those skills, like that's completely taken away from our communities.
Mm.
So that's really where it came from. And then I started to think about it. I was like, actually, and obviously I was thinking about my daughter and I, but it's something that can serve so many people, because there's white people with voluminous hair, there's white people with dreads, there's white people get their
Yeah.
hair braided, there's people who have big hair that they can't fit into a traditional swim cap.
Mhm.
And so that's where the idea came from. And also I was thinking, because I started asking particularly my daughter, for her advice, because I know she will not wear this ridiculous thing.
Mhm.
I'm like asking her for ideas, like, would you wear this? Would this appeal to you? She's like, Mom, I would not go out looking like that. I'd rather miss swimming. so
Yes.
they've been helping me actually innovate some of these ideas, but it's still in development.
I must say, I love us as, Black individuals because we're so innovative. I was talking to Yemu Piri just a couple of weeks ago in her podcast episode dropped last week, and she was saying the need she saw in corporate Australia in terms of, women of color not having mentors, not having a space where they can come together and support one another, particularly those who are mums and you come back into the workforce and people are having, catch-ups and get-togethers when you can't do that. If it's early in the morning, you've got to do school drop-off or daycare drop-off. You have to leave at a certain time because you're doing that school pickup. And so you miss out on this, people who are getting together, catching up and growing and, opportunities with people who are in positions of influence. And so she began a group. And I love us that we see a problem and we don't just stand by and wait for somebody else to have a solution. We are doing something about it. And even when going back to this issue of silence, when people are being faced with issues to do with racism, that people are beginning to speak up now. Before it was very much, I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to be branded as that angry Black woman. And so I'm just going to toe the line. But that is changing. People are speaking up and saying, no, I will not be silenced. I will absolutely say exactly what is going on here. And I will let the public and the justice system be the judge here because what is happening is not right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's high time that we do that, because it's not serving anybody when we are silent about our own experiences of oppression, and injustice, or when we're silent when we witness it to other people around us. So we have, our first obligation is to advocate for ourselves, but also for others around us who are impacted. There could be someone who, you have a colleague at work who's going through things, and the number of people that, because there's a comfort in not speaking up. There's also comfort, and there's a convenience in choosing not to bother yourself with someone's experience of injustice at work. because there is emotional labor involved, and people are often going, oh no, I don't want to get involved, it's too much, etc. But it's like, as uncomfortable as that is, that's an absolute drop in the ocean when you compare that to what that person is experiencing. And where would the world be if we only did things because it served our own interests?
Mm-hmm.
Where would we be? I mean, that's not the world we want to create. That's not the world that any of us wants to leave behind. And so we have to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that's where the work happens. We don't grow in comfort, we grow in discomfort. And the more I think people realize that, and choose to actively do something, the better off we'll all be in the long run, because we're all interconnected, and all of these issues are interconnected, whether we think of it that way or not.
And we didn't get to where we are through comfort. We didn't get to where we are right now having this conversation, or whoever's listening, you didn't get to where you are through just absolutely being comfortable, cushioned, taken care of. You had to do things that made you feel really uncomfortable, cringe, but you made it over to the other side and you just keep going. That is what life is about. You are a highly sought after speaker, Elizabeth. You've been on national and international stages, including the United Nations in Geneva. Tell me about your trip to Geneva, and how did that come about? What did you talk about?
Yeah, so the trip came about I believe it was in 2020. I did a fellowship with the United Nations. It was a human rights fellowship. It was a 3-week program. It was kind of an intensive human rights training program. And we were the COVID era, so we ended up doing it online rather than in Geneva. But I was an alumni of the fellowship program for people of African descent specifically. And one of the key pillars of that program is looking at racial injustice. And so that's how I guess I was a part of that network. Now, the trip to Geneva, was it last year, I believe, in January, came about because they put out a call out. They wanted a whole bunch of alumni to come into Geneva and to engage on different panels based on their own kind of expertise and experiences. I obviously spoke about racial inequality because that's the focus of my work. And more specifically looking at systemic racism in Australia. And because it is a human rights issue, and I've always seen it as a human rights issue, because racial inequality or racial injustice, it starts off with the idea that you are inherently less than, and that's a very harmful notion. And so I spoke about racial injustice, racial inequality, and the systemic nature of racism in Australia, and how it's infused, I guess, in all of our institutions as well. So it's not, we didn't get to where we are out of the blue. There's a legacy of racist policies inbuilt into organizations and institutions, and that legacy has not disappeared. Yes, things have shifted and changed. Laws have been, disbanded, etc., and laws have been changed. But the legacy that is built into the institutional structures is still there. And so I spoke about that at the UN, and it was great to be with, I guess, alumni, but also with other advocates around the world, people of African descent. So people from the United States, people from the UK, Canada, like all over the world. And what's interesting is, despite the fact that we all come from geographically all over the planet, there's such a theme in terms of our experiences. Again, because racial inequality, the root is the same. And so when you've got that root, no matter where the branches go around the world, the root of it, it's there's going to be a flavor in Australia, in the US, and Canada that is very similar. And so we have similar experiences around the world when we talk about racism, because it's inbuilt into all institutions globally. And I think, yeah, so that was my Geneva trip, and that was what I kind of focused on as far as my presentation. The other things I might just mention, which actually came about as a result of being a part of the alumni and then going to Geneva last year, was a group of us came together, particularly in kind of the Southeast Asia region, where we said, hang on a minute, for people living in Southeast Asia and around Australia, there isn't a global network to look at experiences of people of African descent in this region. And so we ended up coming together. It's still kind of in the formation stages, but have founded a network for people of African descent, focused specifically on looking at the experiences of racial inequality that people of African descent experience in this region. And I've learned so much through that experience, like to know that there are people of African descent, for example, in various parts of India and Pakistan who've been there since the 16th century, was mind-blowing. And some of the consultations we were able to have in the region with people of African descent who have lived there for generations. There's such a commonality of experience, but in some regions, just brutal experiences of racism, where people are fighting for basic access to healthcare and school, etc. But again, the basis of the racial inequality is the same. It's far worse in other areas, but we've seen that there's a lack of focus on this region, and also just an understanding that there are Black people in many parts of Asia who have been there for centuries, who are completely at the fringes of society and excluded from opportunities. And so that's something that's grown out of that. And it's been incredible. I've learned so much just by engaging with the group and then holding the consultations in the region and having people of African descent saying, my grandparents lived here. This is what we're called when we walk down the street. And it's a commonly accepted term, but it's a racist term. Again, it's that streak, there's a similarity of racial injustice when you look at it globally. And so the work with the UN has really been, it's been powerful in that sense to go, all of these issues are interconnected at the local level. When we look nationally in Australia, but also globally, there are interconnections across. And in order to address these issues, we need to look at it from a systemic perspective.
Yes, we do. So many things that I could ask you about that cohort, that group of people, so needed. I did not know about the whole existing since the 16th century in Southeast Asia. And no, that's a whole conversation that I'd love to have at some point. You are so right in saying that, racism is the root is the same. It might be in different locations, different people and way of life, but the root, it's coming from the same place and it's giving birth and it is, in different places, but it's still from the legacy that you speak of continues. And what a powerful force then is racism, from its roots, from its origin, to how it has spread out all over the world, and to still be as strong and as powerful as it is today in 2024 is just astounding.
Oh, completely astounding. I think if people can remember, if I think of the analogy kind of like a tree, so the roots are what we talked about, and then it's got the trunk, and then it's got branches, and then it's got the leaves, and then there's the shadow. So I kind of think of racism as that. You've got the roots, you've got the trunk where maybe it's really strong and we're seeing maybe acts of racial violence, where, we've got the branches where there's inequality, but it's kind of not in your face. You've got the leaves, that's going to be, people are going to maybe experience being dismissed casually, etc. And then you've got the shade. And maybe under the shade is where some of the progressives might be, where they go, I'm nice, I'm not racist, I've got Black people in my network, etc. But you're still under that shade. So you've got work to do. We all have work to do again. So that's what I say. I kind of liken it to that no matter which aspect of the tree, we have to address it from the root. I think the people in the clan are maybe part of the trunk that is probably going to be very hard to, we've probably lost them.
Yeah, but we're not
there's people under that shade.
we're not there for them per se. It's the majority, they're such a small number, but it's the majority where the work belongs and where we can begin to see the change. Because if one person can have so much power, like in the school we were talking about a little bit earlier, one person, how much more if all of us come together and begin to speak up and make change and educate ourselves, because it begins by education and not assuming I'm nice and so I don't need to hear this conversation. Yes, you do. We all need to hear this conversation. Almost getting to the end, Elizabeth, I would love to hear a little bit more about this book that's in the making. Wired for Buyers is what you're calling it. And I was reading a little bit about this, book, which I cannot wait to get my hands on. A groundbreaking exploration into how machine bias perpetuates the marginalization of racial minorities across industries. Gosh, how did this particular idea for the book come about?
Thank you for asking. Firstly, I will say the book is far from publication. It's gone through several phases, and I've pushed and pushed the publication of it. But the biggest, I guess, challenge for me has been the PhD. So that's priority number one right now.
Mhm.
But the book came about, it was in 2018 when I came across an article where I was reading this article, and it was about a health device in the 1950s or something. And the article is talking about how the device, somewhere along the process, somebody picked up that the device wasn't accurate for certain groups because it didn't take into account certain factors. And so someone picked it up, but for whatever reason, nobody bothered to actually, address the issue and rectify the problem. And so they went ahead, created this medical device, and for generations have made medical decisions on it. And when I read this, I thought, gosh, people have probably died as a result of misdiagnosis and the wrong treatment administered as a result of wrong reading. And when I read that, I was like, this is horrific. Like, it really stuck with me. And that's where it came from. I read that and I thought, hang on a minute. We often think like machines are, like they're neutral, they're not biased. But I was like, hang on a minute. Machines are, they're inbuilt with bias. They spit out what you put in.
Yes.
And so that's where the idea came from. But I struggled with it because AI didn't exist at the time and there was no kind of language around it.
Mm-hmm.
But I just kept going back to this medical device and going, machines are biased. Every machine that's been created. And I guess I was focusing a lot on health because this was the article I was reading. And I think with health, there's more kind of tangible, real life, direct examples you can kind of derive. So that's where it came from. And I started to collect articles and stories that link to this idea that machines are inherently biased because they're created by biased human beings. And then I parked it for many years because I struggled to kind of have language around it. And then AI came out and it was like, whoa. But then shortly after that, actually before the whole AI, as AI was kind of being launched into the world, I came across a documentary called Coded Bias, and I strongly recommend your viewers watch that if you haven't. Mm-hmm. Incredible piece of work by a Black woman in the US, Dr. Joy Bulumwani. Mm-hmm. And she talks about bias in machines, essentially, and how, for example, law enforcement, they're using particular programs to make decisions about the likelihood of criminality. And of course, they're racist. So it'll see a white person and assume that that person is less likely to reoffend, but an African-American person or a Hispanic person is already deemed by the machine as high-risk offender, regardless of history. And they've done tests and experiments to go, this is completely racist. So I shortly after coming across the article, I came across the Coded Bias. I think someone was telling me about it because I was sharing with them about this article. And I watched it and I was completely blown away. So that's kind of the roots of where the idea for the book came from. But I started thinking more and more about the ways in which, particularly, artificial intelligence is here and it's not going anywhere. And I know there's different schools of thought. There are people that are still completely terrified in the corner and going, I'm going to resist it because otherwise it's going to take jobs, etc.
Yeah.
Look, similar to the Industrial Revolution, you are not stopping this thing. It's going to keep going. So when I thought about it more and more, and the way in which AI technology is being infused into every aspect of our lives, and in terms of, in very kind of real and tangible ways, I started thinking about, hang on a minute, when it comes to racism, if say the Australian Federal Police decide to, use a particular software to make decisions around criminality, that is, the fact is it will disproportionately have a negative impact on Aboriginal people and Black and Brown people. That's a fact. I've seen it already in HR where people are starting to use, and I think this will be interesting to your audience, where people are using AI-based technology to make decisions about candidates.
Yes.
But it's been programmed to see a qualified candidate in a very particular light. So it's going to reject diverse talent because it does not recognize it as talent. It's inherently racist and inherently biased. And I think the more we accept that, it's not about not using technology, because I'm not saying just abandon AI. The reality is not going anywhere. But there has to be more work done at the front end in terms of how the software is developed and how these, and particularly people using it in places like human resources to make hiring decisions. There has to be a lot of work put in at the front end to ensure that you're not producing inequitable outcomes, because that's going to be inequality on steroids with AI. And the more people realize that and realize that there's a lot of work to be done as it develops and progresses, because it's not going anywhere, the better off we'll all be. Because the last thing we want to do is and AI has the potential to create more damage, as it does have the potential to create a lot of good. But if we focus more on shaping it for the greater good, then we're not going to reproduce inequality that's actually going to set us back like 50 years, because that's the potential of AI. And so that's where the idea for the book really came from. It was the article that I came across about the medical device, being completely mortified that, gosh, how many people have potentially died as a result of this device, and then coming across the Coded Bias documentary. And then, of course, AI en masse now, starting to see examples of how it's being used in HR, and people saying, I used this software and it like gave me a reading that wasn't accurate. Mm-hmm. Or even one example actually that my daughter had, and because it happened so many times that I started to think, no, hang on a minute, she's not imagining this. So there's a little app that's like, it's like it's like a face, and you put makeup on them and you make them look pretty. Mm-hmm. I said, Mom, every time I give her dark skin like me, even if I make her really pretty, I always get a low score. But when I make her white skin, she's like, I can put the exact sort of makeup and similar hair and all that. I can make her look almost identical. But when her skin is dark, I lose the game, or I get a low score. But when it's white, so I was going, oh my God, like, this is so, even in games for kids. And, she's like, my little 8-9-year-old is angry and going, this thing is so unfair. It doesn't like me when I make it black. I was like, this is part of the AI technology. And if it's not being addressed, it's going to impact every aspect of our society, from HR decisions, from, decisions being made about criminality with police, to kids' games.
Wow. Oh, this is chilling. This is really, really chilling. And going back to that conversation we were having about subconscious, you just don't even know the bias is there because you're so wired in a different, you're wired in a biased way anyway. It is chilling, but we need to be having these conversations so that we have that awareness and we're just not caught off guard. We need to be having these conversations. And there's a lot of work to be done in the AI space as far as safety, compliance, integrity of data, and fairness and equity. There's just so much work to be done in that space. I wonder, If there was one thing you'd like to leave as a piece of advice to the person listening or even watching us as it pertains to racial and gender equity, what would that be? Just one thing to leave them with.
One thing. I think my one thing would be going back to the notion of learning and discomfort and embracing that. Because, and this is something that I often kind of leave as a takeaway whenever I do training. I say, because people often say, you know, it looks so big. We talk about systemic inequality and racism, and these are huge concepts, and it's baked into our institutions, etc. I'm only one person. I go, every single revolution in history started with one person who said, I've had enough and I will not stand for this and I will speak up. That person influenced the first 5 people around them. It grew to 10, it grew to 100, it grew to thousands, and before you know it grew to millions. So one person has got power if they recognize and are willing to wield that power. It starts with one, but it doesn't end with one, because you need a community of people. And so, yes, one person can make a difference, but it's not one person is going to undo all of this. One person is going to make a decision to stand for equality, and they're going to bring people on board. They're going to inspire people. They're going to encourage people. They're going to have conversations with family members who make racist jokes at the dinner table on the weekend. It could be very convenient and very comfortable to just pretend like you didn't hear anything or nervously laugh or even walk away. But that person has got the power to pull them aside and say, look, uncle, you know, that comment you made the other day, it honestly made me really uncomfortable. And I've been thinking about it. But that person has got the power to influence that uncle who loves them, who sees them as someone who's, you know, this is a person who's dear to them, who does not want to harm them, to go away. I need to think twice before I spit out these ignorant comments that I make, because my niece was hurt or was uncomfortable by what I said. And that person then goes away with some thinking and maybe starting to have some internal dialogue about this. That is the power of one person. We can create ripples of change if we choose to speak up. And we don't have to do it in ways where there's different ways of enacting change, right? But think about the relationship that you have. Who is in your sphere of influence? Who can you speak life into? Who can you encourage? Who can you challenge in ways that other people may not be able to do that? That person's unlikely to come to a workshop that you and I run, like you said earlier. But they will listen to their niece who says, look, I really didn't appreciate that. I was hurt by that comment, or I felt very uncomfortable by what you said. And that person, once they change, I'm just using the uncle as an example, that uncle has maybe got children, other family members who are going to be influenced by the positive change that they have begun in themselves. And so that's about one person. It's your immediate sphere of influence that you can shape, but also the ripple effect that grows. And we don't always know the impact that we have. We can't always measure it. We don't always know. We don't always, 9 times out of 10, don't get feedback.
Yeah.
But choosing to speak up, someone might walk away and completely change the trajectory of their thinking or of their life because of the influence that you've made, because of what you've said. But you've done it with love, and you've done it by holding them, because that's how we win people over. And we can do that naturally when we've got that relationship. You know, I can challenge my auntie or uncle in ways that someone from the public can't, because I've got an intimate relationship with them where I can have these difficult conversations in a behind closed doors safely, but I can influence them positively, and everyone around them will be better off because of the seed that I've planted. So I think that is the power of one person, and that's what I'd really like to encourage your viewers and your listeners to think about, the fact that you do have power, but you only have power if you recognize that you have it. There's just a quote that I just want to leave people with, because this really resonates. And it is, I want to get the author right, so I can credit the right person. But the quote is that the easiest way people give up their power is by not recognizing that they have it. I think it was, bear with me. Yes. It was a quote by Alice Walker. I knew that's who it was. I just didn't want to name the wrong person.
Yes.
And she says the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And an incredible, inspirational, Black woman in the US. So that's what I'd leave people with. You do have power, but you give it away by not recognizing that you've got it.
That is a powerful quote. We will pop it on the show notes as well. One final question for you, very briefly. If fear was not a factor, because I know in the realm of the work that we do, there's a lot of fears that we go through and silencing and all those sorts of things. If fear wasn't a factor, how do you think you'd show up more in your work, Elizabeth?
Wow, that's an incredible question. If fear wasn't a factor, how would I show up more? Ooh, I pick and choose vulnerability in workshops and in terms of what I say, and I kind of gauge the audience, the energy in the room, and then I make intentional decisions about the kind of examples I might share, etc. But if fear was not a factor, because some of those decisions are motivated by fear, and sometimes I think by safety as well. If I don't feel safe to share a particular story, then I won't. But that also comes from a place of fear. What will happen when I put this out there, given that I don't trust the environment that I'm in?
Yes.
I think I would be much more, I would share more of the deeply personal and painful experiences with every single audience, rather than some audience hear it and some don't. Again, that's often a protective mechanism.
Yes.
But I know that there's an underlying fear that also, influences that decision. So that's what I would do if fear wasn't a factor.
Oh, and I feel you. I feel you on that so much as somebody who does this work too. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time. I am so grateful. You have shared in a way, sometimes even though you're in this work like myself, teaching, educating, coaching, holding space, there are those times somebody comes and mirrors and says what you've been saying over and over, but say it in a different way, use a different example, and it just sinks in even deeper. I think that image of that Black girl who has been abandoned will stay with me, even though I've seen it so many times and I have had the same reaction as a lot of other, people of color. There's just something that has stayed with me today. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, the easiest way, I've got two websites. One is www.diversityfocus.com.au. The other one is my website, which is www.elizabethlang.com.au. So either of those two platforms, I can be easily found.
All right, beautiful. Thank you for joining us today and wishing you all the very best, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented from coast to coast.